It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Eugenia Siapera, who is the head of the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. She is also the director of the Center for Digital Policy. She has conducted research in the area of digital media and technologies and questions of social justice. And she is a clear reference in the field for those of us working in these and related areas. So without any further ado, I turn you over to Eugenia for her talk. Thank you so much. Now you press that one and then I'll get out of here. Did you press this? Yeah, you pressed that.
Okay, I think that's pressed. So thank you very much for that introduction, Christina. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to speak to you today about some of our ongoing work on the digital far right. I'm hoping you'll find this is a little bit of a presentation that is not very well articulated together because I'm still working on the various parts of it. So I haven't had yet the time to kind of like put it all together and make it a coherent whole. But I still feel that perhaps like there is you'll find something interesting there. And obviously also very selfishly, I would be looking for feedback in terms of how the various parts kind of work together. So we'll try to kind of discuss today is alternative tech platforms as an alternative media infrastructure. And to do this, theoretically, I will just very briefly cover some of the literature and some of the kinds of discussions on platforms as infrastructures. And then I will go old school, go back to like the public sphere theory. Not necessarily because I value it as a particular kind of like a paradigm, but because it kind of offers us some kind of yardstick or a benchmark against which to kind of judge today's situation. And then, and this is the most part of my talk, is to kind of like walk you through an empirical analysis that I've been doing with some of my colleagues in UCD in terms of this kind of like all tech universe, focusing mainly on two platforms, Bitchute and Telegram. And then I'll try to figure out in the end, are we talking about a new structural transformation of the public sphere, or is something else that is going on? And then finally, if we ever get to that, if I have enough time for this, I would like to outline some policy challenges that we're facing today. And this is using my hat as the director or co-director of the Center for Digital Policy, where we kind of try to figure out how our empirical, not only ours, but like a lot of people's empirical work in digital media can feed into policy in a productive way. And in truth, it's not being very productive, it's mostly critical at this point in time. But anyway, more on this later. So when it comes to platforms as infrastructures, the way I kind of approach them, which is pretty typical in the literature, is as enabling structures that include organizational practices, technical components, and social norms. So it's not only the kind of like the technical aspect, but it's also the way in which social norms feed into infrastructures and organizational practices around them. So the important thing to know about infrastructures is that they're meant to be standardized, stable, interoperable, and scalable. Sorry. Shift towards privatization, fragmented. When we're talking about infrastructure, just to go back and say, okay, what most people have studied is like big motorways, train infrastructures, this kind of infrastructure, also communication infrastructure in terms of broadcast and news distribution networks, things that have like real scale, and most of the times, in fact, almost always are managed by the state on behalf of like the nation as a whole. So when neoliberalism became like the dominant mode of organization, infrastructures fractured, fragmented, and were sold to different companies, private companies to manage. So then this is exactly what happened with the internet, that it was built like an infrastructure for everyone, and then it became fragmented into private companies. And now most of the times the internet as we know it is not really the internet. It's a little bit of Google, it's a little bit of Microsoft, it's a little bit of Facebook and Twitter and so forth. So the discussion around platforms and infrastructures is basically that we have two merging logics. One is the logic of platform, and another is the logic of infrastructure. And this is why Plantin and his collaborators are referring to as the infrastructuralization of platforms and the platformization of infrastructures. Of course, a big thing to note about platforms, and I'm sure you all know it better than me, it's that they rely on data extraction and use. So they're kind of, as Van Dijk and her collaborators say, programmable infrastructures using data. And now the public sphere. Now, why the public sphere? Is, as I said, it's because it provides both a normative and a quasi-historical account of how the public sphere as an infrastructure for the development of public debate and public opinion emerged, according to Habermas, in the salons of the 18th and 19th century. So Habermas tracked the kind of structural transformation of the public sphere in terms of mainly the funding source, but others since have added like the professionalization of journalism as part of the structural transformation of the public sphere, and the shift from print to broadcast as the main kind of like medium, the most popular medium, I suppose. And by broadcast is not only television, but it's also and importantly radio as well. So now we are in a situation where the public sphere as an infrastructure is captured by platforms. And this involves, on the one hand, increasing dependencies, but on the other hand, because platforms act as the infrastructures for the public sphere, that means that they steer the public sphere towards certain directions that reflect the platform dominant values, their economic priorities, and the technological capabilities. And having said this, though, it's important to note that platforms are co-determined by all these factors. It's not that, of course, and we had the discussion partly this morning, you want to talk about power dynamics and then a flow of power, and you want to kind of like acknowledge the fact that we have power asymmetries, but at the same time, I don't want to make it suggest that platforms have all the power and all other type of agency is redundant or non-existent. But also what we should take into account is the fact that platforms are themselves shaped by historical forces and broader social struggles in operation. And I think this is very clear in how the old tech platforms emerged. Generally speaking, alternative platforms aim to offer spaces for alternative ideas, discourse, and organizing. Some of you may be familiar with the whole kind of alternative media approach that is associated with the work of Aton in the early 2000s. And this kind of work has been very, very important in identifying different spaces for, oh, sorry, there's the... We put it in front of Donald Trump's face.
Oh, I don't know what's. No, I can't.
Yeah, minimize. Yeah.
That's why.
Okay. All right. Now, now you can see all this kind of like really long text, and I'm not proposing to read. Sorry, we were in the previous slide, I think. I was looking for. So just I want to place like the all tech platform emergence in a context where when people were talking about alternative media, they were mainly thinking about progressive left-wing media. And then this happened. These kinds of guys kind of like thought, especially after the the mass deplatforming that took place just after 2018, they thought, okay, that's they're going to kick us out of all media, and then we won't have anywhere to publish our views. So then they kind of like said, we're going to build our own infrastructure, and then that we'll have full control over it. And from 2018 onwards, we see a kind of like an explosion of these kinds of platforms that are also in a situation right now that is relatively fluid, where they vie for kind of like a bigger piece of that, like alternative meaning not alternative in the sense of left-wing alternative, but alternative as in the alt-right kind of from that particular political perspective. So it's a politically motivated emergence that that kind of like pretty explicitly positions itself as alternative, both ideologically, but also against the freedom, the censorship that they see that mainstream platforms are imposing. It's also kind of interesting to see how they see, this is the middle definition here by Mark, who is actually a journalist, a US journalist, that they're cloning all mainstream platforms and making them ideologically aligned to the far right or alt-right, if you want to call it. We also have a number of platforms that are considered to be co-opted platforms. So they emerged in a different context, some of them as alternative to mainstream platforms, but not necessarily ideologically kind of aligned to the far right. For example, Telegram or Discord, derive, MeWe, they were all kind of viable alternatives to mainstream platforms, but for various reasons, the far right thought, okay, we need to kind of like, we can use them and have more control over our contents compared to like Facebook or Twitter. So therefore, they kind of moved there and started to occupy them. And this is very, I suppose, very clear with Telegram. And it presents a lot of policy challenges because some of the policy proposals that have been discussed is to take all these platforms off the air, off the whatever, the internet. But with Telegram, it's very difficult because it's also used by human rights defenders in contexts like Iran or Russia. So you don't want to kind of cut off like the basic means for communication between these groups. I also wanted to show you this. I kind of like came across it yesterday. I'm sure you were all gutted that Tucker Carlson was kicked off Fox News, but now everyone is kind of like looking where is he going to go next. And people thought he's going to have like he already has like presence in Rumble, but they thought that this is where he was going to hold his main show. It turns out now that that he's going to move to Twitter, and this is because Twitter is a born-again kind of like based, as they call them, platform. So it's an ongoing situation. But the reason I put this headline up there is one of the reasons is also to see that Rumble has received funding by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, who was also until recently in Meta's executive board, Peter Thiel, who runs Palantir. So for all this kind of like alternative stance, they're getting in some really mainstream Silicon Valley capital, even if Peter Thiel is a known kind of quality among the far right. The bottom picture here is remember when we called about when I mentioned clone technologies. So the bottom part is a based version of ChatGPT. So this is a far right version of it called Gitter. So you go there and then you put a question. I put a question, what does woke mean? And then it gives me this kind of like a response here. I believe the notion of wokeness is nothing but a disguise for radical leftist ideology and political correctness. Really typical kind of stuff. I also played around with this, asking it what is feminism, and you don't want to know what they have to say about this. But just to see that really we're talking about a completely almost autonomous universe of platforms and functionalities that are very clearly aligned to far-right ideology. In terms of the literature, by the way, this meme here, I'm sure that a lot of people will recognize this as kind of like left discourse around technology, but it is in fact a far-right meme around technology. So these questions of decentralization and deplatforming, deplatforming in the sense that a lot of, well, some of the anarchist groups that were using the internet in the period just around the Occupy movement were really very much technophobic, didn't want to use platforms for various reasons, correctly perhaps. But one of the kinds of arguments they were referring to were that we have to have our own servers, and we have to have like decentralized servers federally connected to store our information, and the servers should either belong to us, to our groups, or to neutral entities like universities. And now this these kinds of ideas have been I wouldn't say appropriated, but definitely used by the far right. So in terms of the existing literature, and there's been an explosion recently around this around the all tech platform phenomenon, and partly the reason is because we don't have access to mainstream platform data anymore. Whereas now, if you want to get data freely using API, you go to any of the all tech platforms, and you can write code and download freely these kinds of contents, for the most part anyway. So research here, for example, Rogers has studied the effects of deplatforming. For example, did deplatforming work in terms of removing hate speech from mainstream platforms? Yes, partly it did, or at least at a point in time it did, shortly after the deplatforming. But now we see that that hate speech is alive and well in all platforms, mainstream and alternative ones as well. In terms of the prevalence of hate speech, it has been found that some platforms are worse than others. I think by far the worst of all is 8chan, still is 8chan. We've seen studies on radicalization of discourses, in the sense that that there is a progressive kind of like intensification of othering and polarization of very polarized views, them and us, these kinds of like populist in quotes discourses. There was also a lot of work on COVID-19, and this also highlighted the extent to which topics like health and science, climate science in particular, are becoming very, very polarized and very politicized in the context of all tech platforms. And then we see also some work on cross-platform traffic of contents and narratives. And this is something that is very difficult to kind of research. So if you have any ideas how to best do this, so you see, for example, certain discourses, like some of you may be familiar with this idea of transhumanism. So transhumanism is to use digital media for kind of like the Neuralink, Elon Musk's idea on Neuralink would be part of this, but others are not, as kind of like science fiction types of ideas. So this idea of this discourse and narrative of transhumanism as a means for state to control humans is very much a narrative that emerged in far right in all tech platforms, but now you see it also on YouTube. But who can prove the direction of the narrative? Where did it start from, and what was the incidence across different platforms, and how can we track this? The way we kind of try to do this now is with dynamic topic modeling, but I don't know if it's sensitive enough to pick these kinds of nuances. So in terms of this empirical, of this kind of research on all tech platforms, these are some of the kind of research questions that animate the work that I'm doing with my colleagues. So do these platforms really do anything different, or do they clone and consolidate features from other platforms? Platform structured, and how do they steer and circumscribe the experience of their users? And what are the main principles embedded into and governing their systems? And ultimately, of course, the big question of how do they impact the public sphere? So especially in terms of governance, I think but in part the reason why these platforms emerged, apart from, well, it's connected to platforming, is because of shifts in the content moderation processes of mainstream platforms. So if you think that, a mainstream platform has like content moderation policies, implementation teams, artificial intelligence that does the moderation automatically, what kind of processes do all tech platforms have in place for this kind of stuff, if they have anything? In terms of the research design that and I'm not saying that I've done all of this, but this is what I have in mind that we should do along with my team. The first part is to study all tech as infrastructures, and then to also see the networks and actors that emerge, and then the narratives and contents. And these are some of the preliminary findings that we've come across, and I will try to kind of expand and give you some examples of our findings in the next part of this presentation. In terms of methodology, in studying platforms as infrastructures, we mainly use the walkthrough process, the walkthrough method. So try to identify the key values based on documents from the platforms, see the governance mechanisms, and kind of I had made an account, non-participant observation. So I made an account with Bitchute in particular, and kind of used it to test the various functionalities, but never really posted anything or otherwise kind of interacted in the sense of leaving contents, writing contents or comments or anything like that. My kind of approach to Bitchute, this is in a paper that hopefully will be published shortly in the European Journal of Communication, is a case study on Bitchute. That's in terms of infrastructure and the kind of functionalities that Bitchute is affording to users. And this is the type of stuff I used this in terms of sample documents on Bitchute, and this non-participant observation for around 6 months, although it's probably a bit longer now. So just want to show you now the two pictures of stats that I took, the first one in September 2022 and the other one in March 2023. And then you see that we're talking about growth of this platform, significant growth of this platform, with almost 20 million more users. And that's in the space of about 6 months. Rank that is massively improved. And Bitchute, I have to say, Bitchute is a UK-based platform. It's a European-based platform founded by a British person, and it also is accessible globally. So it's very much used in the US, but it's not as popular in the US as Rumble or Parler or Truth Social, which we don't get in Europe. Truth Social is Donald Trump's platform, but we can't get it in Europe. I tried, but I can't. You can't. So beginning this kind of like discussion in terms of the Bitchute economics, like how do they make money? Because this is a very, very important factor, as you can understand, especially in the context of Bitchute, because Bitchute is not, you know, it doesn't have the capital that Rumble has or Truth Social have. So how do they make money? Basically through subscriptions. Advertising, they have some advertising. The picture below here is the type of banner advertising that they have. The way in which they share the advertising share is basically if Bitchute sources the advertisement, they take 50%. They take all of it. If it's sourced in common with the content creator, they get 50-50. So that's how this, it's a big kind of like chunk that Bitchute earns. But just to say that they only have adverts in a few of their creators' channels, not all of them. So basically their main source of income is subscriptions and donations. And because they were delisted by PayPal in 2018, they're using other forms for getting this kind of income, and Subscribe Star is one of them. Subscribe Star operates a little bit like Patreon, so you kind of go there and leave micropayments for particular creators or particular sites like Bitchute. But you can also kind of donate crypto to them. This is, and the last part of this slide is very, very important. Bitchute, like Telegram, does not make use of any data, user data. So they don't track you, they don't micro-target you, they don't store any data, and they don't process any data of their users. And this is very, very important because it's a complete paradigm shift from the dominant model of platforms. So in part, this is on purpose because they want to present themselves as alternative. And then, of course, a big kind of point of criticism by the far right has been this kind of surveillance mechanism that was set up by large platforms like Meta and Twitter. But so therefore they're saying explicitly that we don't track you, we don't store data. They have some cookies, but they're only very basic cookies to kind of be able to operate their site. And because of this, they're GDPR compliant. Of this is also a very important slide because of the content monetization. So this is the 50% of share income, unless the advert is entirely sourced by the creator. But even if this, sorry, this is a mistake, but because even if the advert is sourced by the creator entirely, the platform still makes money. But the important thing that they have, which is quite different to other platforms, is that they have embedded mechanisms for users to directly kind of like tip or donate to content creators. So you see a video and then you're saying yes, but instead of liking it like you do on YouTube, you just click on that $sign and then you can pay them directly. You can pay the content creator directly. But not all channels are monetized, and that's also quite interesting to note, but a lot of them are. Also, I came across this graphic here from the Pew Research Center that shows that which of these sites ask for donations, and Bitchute is very, very high in terms of like the sites that ask for donation. So I think the main reason for this is because they have this embedded functionality of being able to kind of like pay them directly on the platform. And then of course, on top of this, all creators would have like the PayPal, the Subscribe Star, their crypto wallets, and any form of payment, they'd have it there. more specifically now, in terms of the governance mechanisms, the key value that we can identify for Bitchute is freedom of expression understood in a context of individualism. And these are some of the, like, the top part here comes from their community standards. So they say it quite clearly what they're doing, that Bitchute is a peer-to-peer content sharing platform that aims to put creators first and provide them with a service that they can use to flourish and express their ideas freely, and also, in parentheses, monetize their ideas freely. So this is from the top, and the bottom is like from their transparency report, that they have like their main kind of values there, and you see freedom of expression, opportunity to succeed, which is very important, because this is the kind of monetization, but it's also the way in which they use their newsfeed algorithms. Well, newsfeed, they don't have newsfeed, but their landing page algorithms in the sense of, like, when you land on the page, what kind of contents do you see when you first visit? YouTube, for example, notoriously, you have to log in and then it shows you content that matches your previous kind of like preferences and subscriptions and likes. But Bitchute doesn't target you. So what do they use? I'll come to that in a minute. But for now, this opportunity to succeed refers directly to the fact that everyone who uses the site has the opportunity to be for their contents to be made visible to others immediately and very clearly. Individual responsibility, empowering creators, and decentralized distribution. These are also the same thing that is phrased more clearly here. This is under our commitment, which is part of their content moderation policy. So they're saying what they are about and what they're not about. So they are about, you see here, freedom of expression as opposed to oppression, which would be this the mainstream platforms, but also they say we don't accept incitement either. Opportunity to succeed versus platform bias, people power, mob rule. I'm not entirely sure what they mean here by mob rule, but people power means that they do have metrics that kind of like highlight which kind of videos are more popular and which kinds of creators are more popular. So this is where I base my kind of argument that that they are about freedom of expression, but freedom of expression seen and understood from a kind of like an individual and entrepreneurial kind of a point of view. The Bitchute does have community standards, and it has content moderation processes in place, and this is very much the case because they operate in Europe and they have to have this under the DSA, although Bitchute has not signed any of the, as far as I know at least, and for now, they haven't signed any of the code of conduct for on misinformation or hate speech, but nevertheless, they do have platform, content moderation in place, and they're saying that they block content on the basis of different rules that apply. For example, NetzDG in Germany. So content that is illegal in Germany, you will not be able to access it from Germany. They take down content that is illegal in Europe, but is not illegal in America. So a user in America will have access to these contents, whereas a user in Europe will not have access to these contents. And you can see here the graph that has like a depiction of the kinds of contents that were removed for different reasons. And the main category here is terrorism and violent extremism, second, sexually explicit, and third is incitement to hatred, again in the UK and EU, EEA territories. So that content may still be up in the United States. What I would like to draw your attention to is the numbers, because they're absolute numbers. So 57 individual pieces of content were taken down, 47 and 54 and so forth. So these are individual maybe videos, they're not channels. but individual pieces of content. So I'm not encouraging you to go to Bitchute, but if you go there, I'm pretty sure you'll see a lot more than 54 in an hour. So they do have it, and they nominally stay within the bounds of the law. They do, they have like the processes in place. For example, Truth Social is not available in Europe precisely because they don't have a content moderation policy and an enforcement team in place. So you're not allowed to download it in Europe. The algorithms and affordances, I wanted really to kind of go online and show you a little bit, but I don't want to risk the Zoom people losing me altogether. So I'll just stay here with this kind of static print screen that I have. So you can see here that the main kind of way in which the landing page is structured is through popular, subscribe, trending, and all videos. So if you go to popular, then the metric there is a combination of subscribers, how many subscribers the channel has, and how many views the channel has. And then you see them ordered in this way. In terms of subscribed, you see the channels that you have subscribed to, and in terms of trending, you see broader kind of like trends across the day, week, and month. And the reason I put this in under trending is basically because I want you to see the trending tags that remain the same more or less for as long as I've been kind of like following them up. There are a few shifts, but COVID is still very much trending, and a huge kind of movement to alternative tech platforms such as Bitchute was precipitated because mainstream platforms took a very, very strong opposition to anything that was critical of the lockdown policies, of the vaccinations, and that kind of put off a lot of people who thought they are being censored, and they ended up in these platforms and then down a rabbit hole of more and more kind of like these kinds of content. And then you see other things here. Of course, Ukraine has become a big thing. NWO, which means New World Order. Trump, Jesus, always, and so forth. So you can see here some of the kind of content agenda that exists there. So they do have hashtags. You can use a hashtag for your video, and you can and they have some metrics and some way of ordering the landing page, but they don't have the type of algorithm that either Facebook or Twitter or YouTube have. In terms of being based on your previous likes and subscriptions and so forth. Also, because of this, they don't fall under the stipulations of the DSA in terms of auditing their algorithm, because their algorithm is basically whichever content comes more recently, that's what we're going to show you. But not everything that comes recently. They're ordered on the basis of how many subscribers they have and how many views they have. And I think this is the main kind of like finding for me from this type of analysis, is that this kind of structure supports individual creators. And they say this pretty explicitly, and we see it pretty explicitly on the site. These kinds of micro influencers that act as ideology entrepreneurs. So what we see here is a kind of a large number of relatively small creators operating in a very competitive environment. So I'm not saying that you don't have like the big personalities, like InfoWars is on Bitchute. Some of Tucker Carlson's content ends up there. For sure, you have these kinds of people there, but mostly a platform like Bitchute, it's structured on the basis of these ideology entrepreneurs that would have like not very small, but not very large numbers of followers. From us, I'd say around 20,000 to 100,000 would be pretty typical for most of the of creators that are able to kind of monetize and keep a kind of pretty consistent presence on these platforms. So this is a way. This is the way in which like Bitchute structures its user base, but also what these users get out of Bitchute, and then support the platform because they're incentivized to kind of stay on the platform because of the network effects, because they know that their audiences are there. And in terms of how they operate in this environment, of course, they try to brand themselves. They are pushed to publish often. So anything that happens, from the most minute thing to the biggest thing, it creates endless kind of like content in these platforms, and they have to keep on doing it because otherwise you're going to lose your fan base. And then the emphasis here is on red pilling, revelations, truth. I don't know if that was visible here, but yeah, okay, it's not visible in this particular screenshot, but if you go to Bitchute, like the number, like I'm sure anyone who do like a frequent term analysis, words like revelation, truth, that type of stuff will be very, very common. The creators that I was talking about, you may recognize Paul Joseph Watson down there from InfoWars. He's based in the UK. He has about 80,000 subscribers, 36 million views. This guy, Mark Dice, he's American. He has even more views, like 119 million views. So they do get views for sure. The Crown House, Computing Forever, is Irish. And others. The Crown House, it's an Australian called Max Egan, who writes on these kinds of like conspiratorial topics. So these are pretty common. I mean, they're all kind of individual creators, but this is the type of stuff I mean. These are who I consider to be ideology entrepreneurs. So they would produce content fairly frequently, twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. They cross-publish their content across a number of platforms. So, for example, Computing Forever also has a YouTube presence, but he doesn't post the same kind of content on YouTube, but he certainly posts content that would kind of not divert or kind of like encourage his users to go to his other channels on Bitchute, Odyssey, Ramble, that are video-based platforms, but he also has a channel on Telegram. And the same goes with other creators. Paul Joseph Watson, for example, definitely has like presence across all main all tech platforms, and he tends to publish more or less the same kind of content. So he produces one piece of content and then he publishes it across all his all tech platforms. So they're hedging their bets for sure. So they just don't want to risk another kind of mass deplatforming. Although of course Paul Joseph Watson was never, I think he still has Twitter and YouTube. Many of you know him. He's a patriotic alternative, a far-right successor to the also far-right British National Front, and he's very active. But the reason I wanted to show you his kind of profile here is because this is kind of pretty typical, but you usually don't find it under About, you find it under each video. So follow me on Telegram, Gab, Odyssey, and others have other kinds of platforms listed as well. And here's how you can pay me: Bitcoin, Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash, Monero. These are all kind of crypto, but you can also push this little $sign there, and you subscribe, start to tip them directly without as much money as you want. Functionalities are very kind of important from the point of view of these entrepreneurs, because they allow them to have a constant presence on the sites. So now I want to kind of like move on, and I know I'm welcome here, but I just want to kind of shift tack now and move on to onto Telegram and give you some of our preliminary results on the contents of Telegram channels. But the focus here on Telegram was not necessarily on the far right; it was more on COVID skeptic groups. But and it's kind of like very interesting because we've been doing this now for 2 years under a project that I got funding from the Irish Research Council. So we've been tracking all contents on Telegram from the beginning of the lockdown in March 2020. And there is like really a shift there. So in the beginning, you had COVID skeptic groups who were about COVID skepticism. So you had normal people. I mean, I'm not saying that the far right are not normal, but people who weren't thinking about this in political terms, they just voiced criticisms, objections, some kind of pushback, like how long are we going to suffer through lockdown? Is this the best way of doing it? And then because like of the really very forceful kind of removal of these contents and policing of these contents in mainstream platforms, they ended up on Telegram. They were also organized on Telegram in ways that, and using functionalities that WhatsApp was not affording them. So in WhatsApp, you can only have groups of 200 people, whereas on Telegram, you can have really large groups. So neighborhoods would organize, like South Dublin against lockdown, this kind of stuff. And then in the beginning, they were pretty independent from the far right. There was some crossover, but they kind of stayed each in different parts. Now, we reckon that basically what happened was that anyone who kind of didn't get radicalized left Twitter and these kinds of, Telegram and these kinds of groups. But then the people who stayed on became really politically aligned with the far right. So what the type of methodology that we used here is a combination of topic modeling and digital ethnography. And we extracted topics, but sometimes the topics don't make any sense. So we use digital ethnography to go back and kind of like see, score them, and then use the scoring to feed back into the topic modeling. And in this kind of like iteration, we produce something that we think it's more valid. So this is some of the work that we did, and I color coded here the different contents. So the one here on the left is the what we call the ground truth. So it's the results of the digital ethnography, and the one on the right are the topics, and these the same colors would be the overlaps. So this is what we think is the valid. These are the valid topics. The ones that are color-coded. Safety, nationalism, globalism, New World Order, World Economic Forum, media bias, some politics and current affairs. This is from Computing Forever. It's that guy I showed you earlier. The other kinds of channels are much more based on COVID topics. And then you see, and I'm sure if you are familiar a little bit with the far right, you'll recognize this discourse focusing on children. So this is very important, and it emerged straight after, like in parallel with the pandemic. So it's not for me, it's for the children. So the lockdown, it's the children. The vaccine, no, the children, we have to protect the children. And now they've moved on to like pedophilia, and then you have like all these like elites who are massive pedophiles and Epstein and so forth. You have like the LGBTQ communities who are looking to kind of like corrupt the children. So using this kind of like entry points to you know, attract and kind of like keep the outrage going, because of course we want to protect our children, right? Who wouldn't? So there's and also media bias is very big. So it's this anti-elitist kind of narrative that that goes through all of them: anti-media, elite, and anti-government. A lot of them would be anti-government, and these are based in Ireland. I don't know if I made this clear, but these are Irish channels. So the government in Ireland is a coalition government of two right-wing parties, right-center parties. Here, vaccine safety and criticism, dangers for the children, responsibility blaming national politicians and media, but also they're blaming them because they see them as pawns in the hands of a global elite. Some of the stuff is completely unhinged. Like these people just don't know what communism is. There's no or Marxism. They just are completely clueless. They offer clear solutions. that basically involve ethno-nationalism and a return to traditional patriarchal kind of like family type of values. We also kind of identified in terms of the dynamics that animate this kind of topics, that we identified these three kind of connector topics: the global elites, the mainstream media, and big tech, that would be in the middle of it. This is what is he called, that meme? Soy Wojak, I think. Soy Wojak. So Soy Wojak is basically an average kind of worker, and this is meant to be like a worker for big tech. And they're saying like, oh, the big tech is censoring us. So big tech is a censorship machine. Mainstream media are manipulators, and global elites run the show, and they're behind everything. Also, beginning from like COVID, they expanded definitely to the war in Ukraine, and then this is also kind of pitched at a very kind of sexually charged, like Putin is the alpha male, the kind of like the, what you call them, the Chad, the man, and then other politicians are corrupt, they're pawns and so forth. Take here is basically that that we're not talking about ad hoc narratives, but we're talking about a more or less elaborated worldview. So what happens here is that any topic that enters the old tech kind of universe ends up kind of like being fodder for this kind of like machine that is producing, using everything as evidence that their worldview is true, and that people have to wake up to see the truth, the revelation, the red pill, and so forth. So even kind of like, this is before kind of Elon Musk has a peculiar kind of reputation in all tech media. Some love him, others kind of hate him. That one of the reasons that they hate him is basically because he's Silicon Valley and because of the Neuralink transhuman kind of connection. But they also love him because he made Twitter based. So he, like, Twitter is reanimated by all these kind of like far right people who think like, oh, now we have one of them on our side. But there's no set approach to Elon Musk, for sure. It's a lot of fragmentation. I think for them, it's more important for Musk to do things so that they can produce more content rather than to align themselves immediately and directly under him. And you see this with Donald Trump as well. Like a few years ago, I suppose everyone who was writing on Donald Trump, they would worship him. But now more and more, you see people being very critical of Donald Trump. Anything that kind of like allows them to build more and more content and to use it for branding themselves, it's kind of useful for them here. So the main findings, to kind of like try to summarize all this kind of disparate and kind of like broad information here, in terms of the political economy, alternative tech platforms, in particular Bitchute, that I kind of focused here, is not currently generating much profit, but it's oriented towards building a media infrastructure to attract and retain far-right, ultra-conservative creators. And this is very much what a lot of these platforms were, like Facebook, for example, was doing circa like 2005, 2006, providing a lot of functionalities, and YouTube the same, attracting users. And the moment you're there and you have your 80,000 users, you don't want to leave the platform because like of all these audiences that you've built. And then, of course, far-right audiences are attracted to these platforms because if you don't like, or if you get fed up by one of these influencers, then you can move to the next one, or you can identify others that speak to contents that you're interested in. There is platform interoperability with contents that are cross-published across the whole ecosystem. In fact, you'll see that there are subreddits dedicated on technical problems of how to kind of make the most out of this interoperability and get your content automatically kind of posted across all these platforms. And then very importantly here, and I think maybe this is something for us all to kind of consider in the discussion, they don't make any use of data for anything else. We see a model of platforms that is a post-data intensive kind of model that kind of eschews or overcomes, I suppose, all the kinds of criticisms that we traditionally leverage against like mainstream platforms. So most of the criticisms is like, oh, they're extracting data and they're using this data and they have a surveillance machine and this and that. And then you have like these platforms that they don't do this. Also, of course, now we see the big platforms moving towards this post-data intensive kind of situation because data doesn't generate as much profit for them. So they're looking to kind of have either a two-tiered model with subscriptions and other kind of like premium functionalities offered to some users, like the blue tick famously of Twitter, or other ways of generating money. But data is not doesn't seem to be essential anymore, or the beginning of data not being essential anymore. We see the combined logics here of platforms and infrastructures. So infrastructures, we said, are stable, consistent, standardized. Platforms are multi-sided markets operating for profit, but without data extraction. And then we see far-right ideologies, especially libertarianism, small or no state, ethno-nationalism, white supremacy, anti-feminism, and this us and them populism. All these three logics are kind of combined. Encouragement and support of ideology entrepreneurs that create far-right outrage for sale. And to me, this suggests a kind of like structural transformation. So Habermas famously referred to editors as dealers of public opinion in order to sell advertising, and that was the model for the news media. And now we see basically ideology entrepreneurs dealing in far-right outrage to support themselves financially. So like in Habermas, you had editors that supported the whole industry of news. Now you have like this fragmented space with a lot of individual entrepreneurs kind of structuring it. And they are doing it just for, it's like their own hustle, you know, it's for themselves to make more money. I don't think they're part of any community, but it's kind of interesting because some of us had seen this kind of model, not with a profit making, but this lateral connection being created within the left, but it never happened really. We see them as co-evolving and as mutually shaping each other. So all tech platforms such as Bitchute co-evolves with ideology entrepreneurs. So they kind of like see where it's going basically, and kind of trying to make it work for entrepreneurs so as to hold on to them as much as possible. We have this kind of fragmentation that I referred to earlier, that's difficulty of scaling, but I don't even think they want to scale. I think that as long as it is sustainable for them and they have the little shop set up on these platforms and they get the money, they don't want to be the next Tucker Carlson. Some of them do, maybe, yeah, but most of them just want to kind of keep going. So, and we also see this, that this is why the movement is so resilient, without necessarily having the support of a party or coalescing around like a specific personality, such as Trump. Perhaps that's the best way of expressing it, or try to find the best way of expressing it, a marriage of entrepreneurial individualism that is characteristic of the Californian ideology and neoliberalism with the far-right, ultra-conservative ideologies and conspiratorial thinking. So that's the kind of combination that we can see here. Policy challenges, but I'm going to run through them because I've alluded to them earlier. So the DSA practically regulates platforms as economic entities, but we've seen that this all-tech universe is primarily a political entity. Of course, you're never only political and you're never only economic, but I wonder if like an economic kind of a regulation of platforms primarily as economic entities will work in the case of the all-tech. so the assumption of current regulation is that platforms have incentives to moderate contents because of advertisers. And this is what Tarleton Gillespie, for example, is saying about platforms, that, you know, they moderate contents because they want to hold on to advertisers, but they don't care. The old tech platforms don't really care because their business model relies in part in advertising, but for the most part, it relies on subscriptions. Complies with formal requirements, but this is nowhere near enough. So most of the contents there are the awful but lawful type of contents that are not illegal. So the European Union can't go to them and say, okay, you have to remove this content or else we're shutting you down, because that would be a clear infringement of freedom of expression. And then the provisions for media literacy are definitely fact-checking and raising authoritative voices. That's not going to work in this context at all. And this idea of potentially banning certain platforms, quite apart from the fact that it is really liberal and wrong, both ethically and politically, it's just a constant kind of you know, like in Greek would say, like the problem of the many-headed hydra. In English, I suppose, is the whack-a-mole kind of a game, where you're just constantly in this process of trying to identify and remove problematic contents, and it's just not productive. It's not working. Conclude, I don't know. I'm not being very optimistic about what's going to happen here. We see that all tech both shapes, but it's also shaped by the needs of a disparate, fragmented, but ultimately quite resilient far-right movement. It's difficult to see how current policy could address it. I think one of the main reasons why this is so difficult to deal with is that most of our approaches focus on the circulation of this information and pay much less attention in the context of production of or continuous co-production of this kind of information and contents. So my take is that basically you're not going to resolve this unless you seriously implement serious political changes in the context where we live. So it's basically the poverty and the points of tension that are feeding into this phenomenon. So you can't control the circulation of this information. Only you have to kind of like understand why it's produced in the first place. And I see a lot of billions invested by the European Union in tech solutions to hate speech, and nothing whatsoever kind of like invested in communities that are vulnerable to being recruited by the far right, or those that are indeed targeted by the far right. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your patience.
So much, Eugenia, for this super stimulating talk. I'm just going to hand over now to Stefania Milan, who is going to give some initial feedback and questions to kick off a discussion. So Stefania, I give this to you, and just press that. Oh, no, it's gone now.
No, so what I want to say is thank you for the very rich talk, and I cannot say it was a cheerful experience because we know these things exist. That we, you know, also as scholars often pretend that they don't, because they're painful to watch, and because they're not, you know, also the exposure to field work, what you call the non-participatory observation is still observation, still spending quite a good portion of your time exposed to this sort of content, which is disturbing, I guess, to say the least. It's probably nerving. It's probably something that requires you, I don't know, but to, I guess, to, you know, take distance at some point and detoxify yourself. And I remember actually some activists that were doing something similar in a slightly different environment. And when I asked, so what do you do to cope with the field work that you do? Well, it was not field work, but, you know, but with the type of the content that you collect for actually good reasons to fight some other groups. And they said, oh, I go to the sauna. So I hope that you have an equivalent of sauna or whatever makes you happy and, you know, takes these toxins out of this system. But someone has to do that. And so thank you for doing this work, because indeed we know a lot about the existence of this. In my department, for example, we do a lot of research on memes and on some other more cultural studies approach to at these platforms. But indeed, also what I would be ultimately interested on is the more granular perspective that you provided. Also, for example, what you concluded on, right? So what can be done about this? to make sure, or to soften at least the attractiveness of all of this to, unfortunately, a bunch of people who are, fueled in their, alignment to certain ideas by exposure to this platform. So the policy consequence, I think it's a very important venue to take also a research of this kind. And what you said about the fact that the European Union puts a lot of money into providing structural alternatives, but none into maybe doing the actually much more important, much more difficult also work in trying to make sure that people don't fall into the trap, so to speak. It's not messages that the European Union or any other policymaker would like to hear, probably, because it's a different type of engagement. It's not solvable with a sort of infrastructure approach of the projects that we know so far get funded. But it's very important. What I was also amused to discover, and amused, in between inverted commas, is that I come like you from observing alternative media up close, and the other alternative media. I mean, like what we used to call the alternative media, the movements that we like to be exposed to. And as we know, those experiences, I mean, they go with social movements, or like social movements, their existence, I mean, it goes in waves. So it's physiological that some point died out or dry out simply. But then there were some recurrent problems there, which these people seem to have solved. And one of them is, the problem of reproducing and maintaining a critical mass past like specific events or current. This seems to be a pretty stable critical mass, right? Always there, no matter what happens. And I mean, the pandemic and many other events actually just contribute then to, I mean, they're filtered, as you pointed out, through, they're interpreted to this worldview, which is much more solid than actually probably what a lot of the left-wing activists would have had. I don't know. Very sad observation. But also the other problem that these people seem to have solved compared to alternative media as we knew them is the issue of the sustainability over time. They're shameless asking for money. I mean, what you saw about this British nationalist with capital N also that you had there, that he had all these venues and possibilities for you to pay your share shamelessly, but also knowing that people are willing and can do so. It's one of the ways to solve the problem of sustainability. Of course, it's not the only one, but I mean, there was also the cross-platform and that type of stuff. But building also on these other phenomena like Bitcoins seems to work well for them, at least as far as we can tell from your story. Now, 3 points for to broadening up the conversation. So there are a combination of questions, and in fact, some of the questions that I had popped in my mind, and I was listening to you, you actually beautifully took your argument home towards the end, but I would like to know even more. So it's not that you have not provided answers, but I would like to give you the opportunity to give us even more excitement there. But the first concerns actually the geography, and we used to think of the internet as a boundless space, whereas geography has been already now for like maybe 15 years forcibly back into the internet, not only in the form of national legislation, but also of course in the form of national priorities like and strategic decisions on cyberspace, or the more kind of AR cybersecurity type of discourse. But then this was also visible on when it comes to content moderation and what you call the inability of regulation to address the alt tech and far right. So I wonder whether this is more like a tension that I identify here. On the one hand, you have geography that comes in and is a very concrete presence, because in Germany certain content is not allowed, in other country content is allowed. Can this geography, which has disturbed many observers of the internet of early days, like me, because we always thought that the internet was maybe something different, but can actually this geography come back, help in a way or another to strengthen our ability to fight this type of phenomenon or not? I don't have really even like a better way of phrasing this question, so I'm not sure it's clear. But is the fact that in Germany certain things are not allowed, is it going to give me, policymaker in Spain, more teeth to act? Probably not. But or is what sort of level can we hang on level of legislation, for example, in order to try to act here? Probably none, but I don't know. It's just like, I would like to know more about your thought about geography and then policy challenges as well. So that will be my point number one. The second relates this individual versus collective tension. So as we know, I'm interpreting a lot of this to what I know, the literature of community and alternative media, and there was a lot of emphasis on community there, whatever the community was. Sometimes geographical, sometimes a community of interest, sometimes an imagined community as well. But the emphasis was always on the collective. Here, the emphasis seems to be also on the collective. To me, it seems a list because there's a lot of commonality, a lot of share. But then you also have these micro influencers that are very key actors and that I guess also build micro communities around them, which are in a way or another discrete from others. So I would like to know more about this individual versus collective tension. Also thinking about the way we used to navigate this tension in what we used to know as alternative and community media. So if you can comment to that, because to me it sounds very interesting. I have to say this question has lingered around with me since the advent of social media, because there is also in the language of social media platforms a lot of reference to community. And I was always wondering, and I always wanted to write a theoretical piece on that, never got around to do that. So maybe you have an answer based also on this type of communities. So these individuals versus collective, where's the emphasis, how one fits the other, and so on and so forth. And then the third point, you had also in the abstract, you were asking, what can we learn about digital activism from the alt-right? And thinking about, reposition also the vocabulary, you already had some very interesting points towards the end. Rethinking the notion of the public sphere, what you call the structural transformation of the public sphere. And then you refer to Habermas. I would also like to know your thought, if any, if relevant, about other definitions of counter-public sphere, so the more feminist pushback against Habermas. With any of that, I mean, I know it sounds really much at odds, right? Using feminist notions of the counter-public sphere to interpret something which is definitely not feminist, but also, at the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to the value set. But still, I don't know, is there anything that can be learned if we put these two in communication or close to each other? Again, the notion of community. And I was also very much interested in this idea of the post-intensive. So my question was, what can we know about platforms and infrastructures as notions? And then you came up with this beautiful post-data intensive kind of model. And we have seen it in operation here. If you have to extrapolate this model, what will this model be good for? So is there anything, because I mean, decentralization, that was in one of your slides, is also one of the buzzwords of the opposite of the end of the ideological spectrum. So diaspora, those other examples that always preached and failed to implement, but preached decentralization. And decentralization is still a buzzword, when it comes about any model for data sharing and data storage. So if these people are found temporarily or are battling with or trying to consolidate this post-data intensive kind of model of platform, is there anything that we can learn in terms of rethinking other platforms that are not this mean, but that could appeal also to people who share some concerns about data ownership and the centralization of the social media sphere? So I just leave it at that. Thank you so much for the very enriching talk, and also once again for doing all this very important yet very painful work.
Stefania, and now you leave me with a task of having to address this like really difficult and challenging questions. So so I don't have ready-made answers for any of these, but just a few kind of like remarks in terms of the geography, because this is something that I've tried to think through, and I don't know that geography will be. Basically, the limitation is not geography, the limitation is ideological. So for sure, you can kind of like deal with this. If you apply maybe a Chinese version of the internet or an Iranian version of the internet, you can deal with it. So I don't know that it makes a lot of difference if you're in Ireland or the Netherlands or Germany, as long as you're ideologically committed to principles of liberalism, within Europe, fundamental rights that have enshrined the freedom of expression as a fundamental right. There's very limited kind of like very real limitations in terms of what you can do about this. And I'm not a liberal, but I kind of tend to agree that freedom of expression is an important value. And that if we lose this, then we lose a lot of other things with it. So I think that this kind of like geolocation maybe serves some kind of like purposes, but I don't think it's a solution. Also, very important to note is that what Germany does, it's not something that a country like Ireland can do or a country like Greece can do. Germany is Germany. It's big, it's powerful. Platforms listen to it. That doesn't mean that they're going to listen to a smaller country, if only because if it creates a lot of operational problems for them, they're just going to say bye-bye and see you later. And we know that this is apparently what Elon Musk is thinking of doing with Twitter, because Twitter is nowhere near being ready. In fact, they fired all their content moderation and safety teams, and the DSA requires that you have like a lot of content moderators in place. So Twitter says basically we're not going to be able to do it, and if you keep on pressing us, Twitter is going to leave the European market. And I personally don't think it's going to be a big loss to Europe now that the way Twitter is, but still, when it comes to the platform bottom line, they're going to go with their bottom line rather than anything else. So I think it's basically pretty limited in terms of what nation states can do geographically. Now, the second question about individuals and community, my God, it's kind of like a very difficult one, because I don't know that there is a community in the far right. I don't get this impression. I get the impression that they mobilize the word people a lot, the people, but it's the people versus the elites. So I don't think they have the community. Well, they did have like, the lockdown channels did have community because they were local. They were people knew each other face to face, and they had community. But they haven't stayed. They're not active anymore, or they have morphed into something else. And another thing that is maybe specific to the far right in Ireland, which is the one that I know best, it's that these people are really, really fighting with each other. Really, really fighting. Yeah. So there are a lot of tensions there and real bitchiness. So there's a kind of like lawyer that said crowdsourced basically, and she got like around 130,000 euro to launch a class action on behalf of citizens who were harmed by the lockdown. So supposedly she was taking the government to court for this with money that she had crowdsourced from these kinds of Telegram channels, and then she did nothing. And then one person that I know, I've seen the content, said like, by the way, Tracy, what happened to the crowdsourcing funds that you amassed? And then like everyone turned on this woman for asking like a basic accountability question. You gathered like 130,000 euro. What did you do with it? And like, they just jumped at her, and this is pretty common. So so I don't know that there is much community there. Definitely not in the sense that more left wing or more progressive kind of like groups organize. But for sure, there are people who follow these blogs, and I don't know how. You'd have to find some way of expressing what they are, maybe followers, groups of followers, but like communities in the sense of having relationships and care for each other. I don't know that this is there. Now, the question of the third question about data intensive and post-data intensive, it's basically, I should have mentioned a term that I kind of borrowed from my colleague James Steinhoff, who works on synthetic data sets. And I have to admit that I find this kind of work really, really fascinating, because we've seen this now kind of happening in the last few years, especially because now Facebook is no longer the trending platform paradigm, and Facebook depended a lot on this micro-targeting for revenue. But now we're in the middle of, not in the middle, in the beginning of a new credit crunch and financial crisis. So that means that all retail and all advertising is diminishing, and the profit margins that Facebook had a few years ago are nowhere near as high as they are today. So you see like a squeeze there, and because people can't extract any more profit from data, the first thing is they want to diminish the decrease costs, so they're laying off people. And the second is that they're trying to find new kind of ways for coming up with profit, and that is either kind of like doing more with the data they have collected, and this is probably the AI and ChatGPT kind of shift. And the second is to move beyond data and see what else can be done. So anyway, this is the broader kind of political economic context, and within this, these old tech platforms didn't want to collect data. For one of the reasons was basically they didn't want to use any cloud, and they didn't want to have to deal with servers. So the way in which Bitchute operates is basically the same as BitTorrent. So it's like their clients, people's computers, and that's how they deal with it. And this is used by left-wing organizers as well, use like torrent type of decentralized technologies. So I don't know if this kind of like addresses your points to some extent, but I think I maybe could open it up now, and thank you.